It's a new year, 2024, and what better way to jump straight into it than with a vehicle which you could argue is probably the single most beneficial form of car review that I do in Gran Turismo, which is what I used to call high rollers. The vehicles which genuinely do take way longer to earn, the equivalent of probably what in the older games maybe prize cars would have been, the vehicles which you couldn't buy so you had to invest a significant amount of time to unlock said vehicle. These days the equivalent is just pretty much having a 20 million credit price tag. And of course that's a discussion that I've had before. I personally do wish that we still had prize cars in some cases instead of just pay to win. But for those who maybe don't want to grind that much for a car that isn't necessarily worth it, or maybe you have the cash but don't want to waste it on a vehicle like this if it's not very good, what is the car like? Well, thanks to some cash grinding, which I did over the past few weeks in particular, thanks to exploits, etc., I ended up buying two of the very expensive cars that I didn't already have, the classic racing version of the Mercedes 300 SL, which of course was 20 million, and this one, the 1938 Alfa Romeo 8C 2900B Touring Berlinetta, a stunning looking car. I recall talking about this one before, I think it was the actual release of GT7. I think this was one of those leaked vehicles which we saw, something like that. A fantastic addition to the game in terms of being a legit vintage car. Those of you who know my taste in cars, both in real life and in games, know that I have all the time in the world for vintage cars. I love classics, but vintage cars do not get enough love. I'm talking like post-war, even pre-war stuff. And the funny thing is, Gran Turismo actually was at a point where they had a few really good ones. The Ford Model T, the Patent Motor Wagon, the Daimler Motor Carriage, the Audi Streamliner, and then it kind of went away a little bit around Gran Turismo 6. You had the Streamliner in there still, but we lost stuff like the Model T, and now we've started to see a few of these creeping back in, which is so good to see for fans like myself, a pre-1940s car with that beautiful swoopy design, some Art Deco inspiration in some cases throughout the years. This one is, if nothing else, a stunning collector's piece, fantastic for photography, but here's the question. Of course, the question that has to be answered, is it worth buying? Not just for the photographers, for the painters, for the collectors, but for the racers. Because in a game like GT Sport, probably more so than 7, but certainly in 7 as well, there's not really too much point in having a car if it's just going to sit in the garage, at least if you've spent this much time in grinding to buy it. So what is this thing like? Well, let's talk standard numbers first. It sits at less than 400 points, 390, which isn't really going to surprise anyone. It's 179 horsepower in terms of its stock output, so nothing too special there. The engine size is decent, 2.9 litre. It is incidentally supercharged, interestingly, and it weighs just over 1,300 kilos, so similar in some cases to like a moderately sized modern hatchback. You can drop the weight quite a lot, barely 1,000 kilos, and you can bump up the horsepower quite a bit, helped not least of which by the upgraded supercharger. You can do a low end and a high end, and with that upgrade, as well as everything else, you are looking at the best part of a 300 horsepower car. So not too bad, 1,000 kilos, 300 horsepower, those sound like decent enough numbers. So what is it like to actually drive? Well, with a vintage car, you always expect it to have a certain kind of mushiness, and I can confirm from real life, even from the vehicles that I've owned, and I haven't currently owned anything from pre-1940s. I've had some 50s stuff in terms of motorbikes and scooters, and I've had 60s in terms of cars, and even in those eras they are a little bit more wallowy, you could say, a bit more boat-esque in the case of certain American cars and larger luxury vehicles, and that of course needs to be properly translated to a game. The funny thing that I've noticed is, when it comes to Gran Turismo, they actually don't do quite as good of a job of that as I would have thought. See, the classics do tend to translate quite well. If you jump into something like a muscle car, then they do wallow around, the brakes are a bit weak, they have that traditional, especially from America, very short ratio gearing, making the top speed not that good. But in the case of vintage cars, maybe it's just me, but I find them to be kind of a little bit too good. Like, you jump into something like this, and I'm sure as good as it was in its day, I would kind of expect a vehicle like this to actually be underwhelming, and it's appropriate for it to be. When you jump into the Ford Model T, you don't want it to impress you. It's not supposed to. It's a century-old vehicle that's the birth of the motor trade. You want it to feel dated. Otherwise, you'd be thinking to yourself, well, either this game isn't as advanced as I was hoping it was in terms of replicating the real-world feel of a car, or cars haven't advanced that much if it actually feels like that in real life. Now, in the case of this one, maybe it does feel fantastic. I guess that's kind of a good sign though, because the fact that this thing is naturally pretty damn good already, not in terms of straight line performance, I mean, it's 180 horsepower, so it's less than an Integra Type R, but through corners, it's not bad at all. You can give that traditional, classic or vintage approach of kind of steering with the throttle, where you can power that back end around corners. But overall, I would actually say it's a pretty nice car to work with. Now, whether or not this one is an essential purchase, or if it's something you should really put the time into grinding for, well, that one I'm probably going to swing a little bit closer to saying no on. Which might surprise you, because for all the praise I've been giving it, and it is a gorgeous car, and certainly a fantastic new vintage edition, it's not exactly a top-tier racer. Even in comparison to other classics in the game, you can easily spend 20 million credits on a car which you could get a whole lot more use out of. If you go for something like, you know, a Ferrari 250 GTO even, or even more so something like, on the slightly cheaper end, the P4. Or something like a Jag XJ13. You know, those are legitimately really quick cars. And obviously they're a lot newer, but they are still legendary classics. There's even achievements in the game associated with some of those. This one, I would say, feels pretty squarely in the purely collector's side of things. It's good, but it's no race car. And although I haven't actually driven the expensive Mercedes yet that I purchased, I would imagine that one will be a little bit better, but perhaps similar in that way. For me, I find it fantastic to have cars like this in the game, but I feel like myself and some of you might be in the minority there. I feel like most players, when they're spending that kind of money, they probably want a little bit more bang for buck in terms of how often they're going to use it. And for a car like this, it's similar to how if the Ford Model T came back and it cost something like 10, 15, 20 million, well, for 99% of players, there is no way that it's ever going to be worth that to you because it's just so slow. But as I've said on the channel before, I would happily pay that for one if it came back. I would pay 100 million credits for a patent motor wagon, and I wouldn't complain at all, despite the fact that it takes about 9 days to do a lap of the Nürburgring. Of course, somebody famously did do that back in Gran Turismo 4. I would still happily pay it because, you know, that's what you expect. It's a literal museum piece. You are buying history in a game. This is much more so squarely in that end of the buying sphere and on the buying spectrum, rather than something which you're going to use all the time or some kind of hidden OP classic. It is not that. It's a lovely car. And aside from that, there is one glaring thing which has to be said, and you will 100% see it in the video in chase cam. I don't understand what Polyphony is doing in this game. They did it in GT Sport, they've done it in the past with some other cars. The camera is horrendous on this vehicle. It's horrendous on the Volkswagen Samba bus, it's horrendous on this one, there are multiple other ones, it's horrendous on the Fiat 500, which is weird because it's on the total opposite end of the spectrum in terms of size. You can barely see past the car. I had to drive it in either cockpit cam or bumper cam just to be able to see what was in front of me. And although it's a fairly large vehicle, you know, in terms of its overall look, it's not that big. It should be a car that you can at least see past. And even though for many people that's probably not that important, it is something to note, because I do find it quite annoying when you can't legitimately enjoy looking at your car while driving it, otherwise you won't be able to see anything in front of you. So, is it a gorgeous car? Absolutely. It's stunning in so many different colours, especially if you go for more of a pastel palette from back in the day. The colour that I chose here, for example, is directly and unabashedly inspired by the Cord 812, in my opinion one of the most beautiful classic American cars. So yeah, it's a fantastic collector's piece. But for the racers among you, well, maybe not so much. There's not really anything that this can do that plenty of way cheaper classics can do anyway, and sometimes they can do it better than this one. Handling wise, you can definitely feel its tail likes to kick out. Performance is reasonably good, but even something like an S13 Silvia can chase it down in a straight line, so nothing too special there. And I'm, of course, referring to its stock performance, not tuned. And to be honest, if you are going to go for the vintage side and have more fun with performance, you might want to go for something maybe like the Mercedes Barker Tourer that I reviewed. I think it was the S Baker, I think it is Tourer, that blue and chrome one. And I recall it being, I think, a little bit cheaper as well. So this one is almost 100% on the collector's end, like I said, and what better way of kicking off 2024 than with a really expensive car in Gran Turismo. So, of course, give me your thoughts down below if you've already bought it, and I'll see you next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.